Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Beautiful. So last week we were introduced to Wizard of Earthsea by Ursula K, and some things happened. We were introduced to our protagonist, Gedd, who was a young boy on the island of Gaunt. Was everyone here last week? I'll skip the recap if everyone was here.
I wasn't here last week.
I was here, but I appreciate the recap as my ears didn't follow too well.
Good. Brief recap then. Gedd is a young boy on the Isle of Gaunt, has some innate magical abilities, trains with the local village witch as much as she can. His town of 10 alders, gets attacked by some not so nice people. He pulls a bunch of illusion and other sorts of sorcery out of his hat, I guess we'll say, and saves his village. Attracts the attention of the powerful wizard on the Isle of Gaunt, who takes him under his wing, takes him to his house, and starts to train him up. But he's a slow-talking, kind of mellow sort of guy. And Gedd is a hot-headed, I don't know what, 12-year-old, wants to prove himself in the world and be famous and known for his power, and kind of prideful. And so it's not a great fit of relationship, although the wizard Guinn does say at one point in time that he wishes, he won't force Gedd to stay with him, but he wishes Gedd will stay with him because what he has to teach is what Gedd needs to learn. Nonetheless, momentous events. Gedd peeks a look at a spell book and summons a shadow of some sort. Not so good, kind of a bad thing. Guinn comes and banishes it, and then they sit down and they have a serious chat. And Guinn says, "Look, it'd be great if you stayed with me, but if you want something different, I'll send you to the Isle of ROSC, which is where the School of Wizardry in the archipelago of Earthsea is, of which Gaunt is one of many islands." And where we ended last night, Gedd says, "Master, I will go to ROSC." And that's where we're picking up. So, as they say, without further ado, I keep looking at Bonnie with that giant smile, and I think, wow, Bonnie's really happy, but Bonnie could be in the background crying there, and I wouldn't even know it. She's hiding behind a static smile. Anywho.
If you have a hard time hearing, just put it in the chat box and we'll try and address it.
Oh, let me change things so that I can see the chat box then.
Well, or I could help with that.
All right. Good. Good, I can see the chat box. And as they say, without further ado, we shall begin. "Master," he said, "I will go to ROSC." So a few days later, on a sunny morning of spring, Guinn strode beside him down the steep road from Overfell, 15 miles to the great port of Gaunt. There, at the land gate, between carven dragons, the guards of the city of Gaunt, seeing the mage, knelt with bared swords and welcomed him. They knew him and did him honor by the prince's order and their own free will, for 10 years ago, Guinn had saved the city from earthquake that would have shaken the towers of the rich down to the ground and closed the channel of the armed cliffs with avalanche. He had spoken to the mountains of Gaunt, the mountain of Gaunt, calming it, and had stilled the trembling precipices of the Overfell as one soothes a frightened beast. Gedd had heard some talk of this, and now, wondering to see the armed guardsman kneel to his quiet master, he remembered it. He glanced up, almost in fear, at this man who had stopped an earthquake, but Ogion's face was quiet, as always. They went down to the quays. Quays? I've never known how to say that word. They went down to the docks, where the harbor master came hastening to welcome Ogion and ask what service he might do. The mage told him, and at once he named a ship bound for the innermost sea, aboard which Ged might go as passenger. Or they will take him as windbringer, he said. If he has the craft, they have no weather worker aboard. He has some skill with mist and fog, but none with sea winds, the mage said, putting his hand lightly on Ged's shoulder. Do not try any tricks with the sea and the winds of the sea, Sparrowhawk. You are a landsman still. Harbor master, what is the ship's name? Shadow, from Andredes, bound for Horttown with furs and ivories. A good ship, Master Ogion. The mage's face darkened at the name of the ship, but he said, so be it. Give this writing to the warder of the school on Roke, Sparrowhawk. Go with a fair wind. Farewell. That was all his parting. He turned away and went striding up the street away from the docks. Ged stood forlorn and watched his master go. Come along, lad, said the harbor master, and took him down the waterfront to the pier where Shadow was making ready to sail. It might seem strange that on an island 50 miles wide, in a village under cliffs that stare out forever on the sea, a child may grow to manhood never having stepped in a boat or dipped his finger in salt water. But so it is. Farmer, goatherd, cattle herd, hunter, or artisan, the landsman looks at the ocean as at a salt, unsteady realm that has nothing to do with him at all. The village, 2 days' walk from his village, is a foreign land, and the island, a day's sail from his island, is a mere rumor, misty hills seen across the water, not solid ground like that he walks on. So, to Ged, who had never been down from the heights of the mountain, the port of Gaunt was an awesome and marvelous place. The great houses and towers of cut stone and waterfront of piers and docks and basins and moorages, the seaport where 100 boats and galleys rocked at quayside, still tripping me there, or lay hauled up and overturned for repairs, or stood out at anchor in the roadstead with furled sails and closed oar-ports, the sailors shouting in strange dialects, and the longshoremen running heavy laden amongst barrels and boxes and coils of rope and stacks of ore, the bearded merchants in furred robes conversing quietly as they picked their way along the slimy stones above the water, the fishermen unloading their catch, coopers pounding, and shipmakers hammering, and clam sellers singing, and shipmasters bellowing, and beyond all, the silent, shining bay. With eyes and ears and mind bewildered, he followed the harbor master to the broad dock where the Shadow was tied up. And the harbor master brought him to the master of the ship. With few words spoken, the ship's master agreed to take Ged as passenger to Roke, since it was a mage that asked it, and the harbor master left the boy with him. The master of the Shadow was a big man and fat, in a red cloak trimmed with a pelluifer, such as Andradian merchants wear. He never looked at Ged, but asked him in a mighty voice, "Can you work the weather, boy?" "I can." "Can you bring the wind?" He had said he could not. He had to say he could not. And with that, the master told him to find a place out of the way and stay in it. The oarsmen were coming aboard now, for the ship was to go out into the roadstead before night fell and sail with the ebb tide near dawn. There was no place out of the way, but Ged climbed up as well as he could onto the bundled, lashed, and hide-covered cargo in the stern of the ship, and clinging there, watched all that passed. The oarsmen came leaping aboard, sturdy men with great arms, while longshoremen rolled water barrels thundering out the dock and stowed them under rowers' benches. The well-built ship rode low with her burden, yet danced a little on the lapping shore waves, ready to be gone. Then the steersman took his place at the right of the sternpost, looking forward to the ship's master, who stood on a plank let in at the jointure of the keel with the stem, which was carved as an old serpent of Andrad. The master roared his orders hugely, and Shadow was untied and towed clear of the docks by 2 laboring rowboats. Then the master's roar was, "Open ports!" And the great oars shot rattling out, 15 to a side. The rowers bent their strong backs, while a lad up beside the master beat the strokes on a drum. Easy as a gull oared by her wings, the ship went now, and the noise and hurly-burly of the city fell away suddenly behind. Then it came out in the silence of the waters of the bay, and over them rose the white peak of the mountain, seeming to hang above the sea. In a shallow creek on the lee of the southern armed cliff, the anchor was thrown over, and there they rode the night. Of the 70 crewmen of the ship, some were like Guinn, very young in years, though all had made their passage into manhood. These lads called him over to share food and drink with them, and were friendly, though rough and full of jokes and jibes. They called him Goatherd, of course, because he was Gauntish, but they did not go further than that. He was as tall and strong as the 15-year-olds, and quick to return either a good word or a jeer, so he made his way among them, and even that first night began to live as one of them and learn their work. This suited the ship's officers, for there was no room aboard for idle passengers. There was little enough room for the crew, and no comfort at all in an undecked galley crowded with men and gear and cargo. But what was comfort to Ged? He lay that night among corded rolls of pelts from the northern isles and watched the stars of spring above the harbor waters and the little yellow lights of the city astern, and he slept and waked again full of delight. Before dawn, the tide turned. They raised anchor and rowed softly out between the armed cliffs. As sunrise reddened the mountain of Gaunt behind them, they raised the high sail and ran southwestward over the Gauntish Sea. Between Barinsk and Torhaven, they sailed with a light wind, and on the second day came in sight of Havnor, the great island, heart and hearth of the archipelago. For 3 days they were in sight of the green hills of Havnor as they worked along its eastern coast, but they did not come to shore. Not for many years did Ged set foot on that land or see the white towers of Havnor Great Port at the center of the world. They lay over one night at Kembermouth, the northern port of Way Island, and the next at a little town on the entrance of Felkway Bay, and the next day passed the northern Cape of O and entered the Ebenor Straits. There they dropped sail and rowed, always with land on either side and always within hail of other ships, great and small, merchants and traders, some bound in from the outer reaches with strange cargo after a voyage of years, and others that hopped like sparrows from isle to isle of the innermost sea. Turning southward, out of the crowded straits, they left Havnor astern and sailed between the 2 fair islands, Ark and Ilion, towered and terraced with cities, and then through rain and rising wind, they began to beat their way across the inmost sea to Roke Island. In the night, as the wind freshened to a gale, they took down both sail and mast, and the next day, all day, they rowed. The long ship lay steady on the waves and went gallantly, but the steersman at the long steering sweep in the stern looked into the rain that beat the sea and saw nothing but the rain. They went southwest by the pointing of the magnet, knowing how they went, but not through what waters. Ged heard men speak of the shoal waters north of Roke, and of the Borleus rocks into the east. Others argued that they might be far out of course by now, in the empty waters south of Camery. Still, the wind grew stronger, tearing the edges of the great waves into flying tatters of foam, and still they rowed southwest with the wind behind them. The stints at the oars were shortened, for the labor was very hard. The younger lads were set two to an oar, and Ged took his turn with the others as he had since they left Gaunt. When they did not row, they bailed, for the seas broke heavy on the ship. So they labored among the waves that ran like smoking mountains under the wind, while the rain beat hard and cold on their backs, and the drum thumped through the noise of the storm like a heart thumping. A man came to take Ged's oar, sending him to the ship's master in the bow.
Look at that.
Rainwater dripped from the hem of the master's cloak, but he stood stout as a wine barrel on his bit of decking and looked down at Ged and said, "Can you abate this wind, lad?" "No, sir." "Have you craft with iron?" He meant, could Ged make the compass needle point their way to Roke, making the magnet follow not its north, but their need. That skill is a secret of the sea masters, and again, Ged must say no. "Well then," the master bellowed through the wind and rain, "you must find some ship to take you back to Roke from Horttown. Roke must be west of us now, and only wizardry could bring us there through this sea. We must keep south." Ged did not like this, for he had heard the sailors talk of Horttown, how it was a lawless place full of evil traffic, where men were often taken and sold into slavery in the South Reach. Returning to his labor at the oar, he pulled away with his companion, a sturdy Andradian lad, and heard the drum beat the stroke and saw the lantern hung on the stern bob and flicker as the wind plucked it about, a tormented fleck of light in the rain-lashed dusk. He kept looking to westward as often as he could in the heavy rhythm of the pulling oar, and as the ship rose on a high swell, he saw for a moment over the dark, smoking waters a light between clouds, as it might be the last gleam of sunset, but this was a clear light, not red. His oarmate had not seen it, but he called it out. The steersman watched for it on each rise of the great waves and saw it as Ged saw it again, but shouted back that it was only the setting sun. Then Ged called to one of the lads that was bailing to take his place on the bench a minute, and made his way forward along the encumbered aisle between the benches, and catching hold of the curved prow to keep from being pitched overboard, he shouted to the master, "Sir, that light to the west is Roke Island." "I saw no light," the master roared, but even as he spoke, Ged flung out his arm pointing, and all saw the light gleam clear in the west over the heaving scud and tumult of the sea. Not for his passengers' sake, but to save his ship from the peril of the storm, the master shouted at once to the steersman to head westward toward the light. But he said to Ged, "Boy, you speak like a sea master, but I tell you, if you lead us wrong in this weather, I will throw you over to swim to Roke." Now, instead of running before the storm, they must row across the wind's way, and it was hard. Waves striking the ship abeam pushed her always south of their new course, and rolled her and filled her with water so that the bailing must be ceaseless, and the oarsman must watch lest the ship rolling should lift the oars out of the water as they pulled, and so pitch them down among the benches. It was nearly dark under the storm clouds, but now and again they made out light to the west. enough to set a course by, and so struggled on. At last, the wind dropped a little, and the light grew broad before them. They rode on, and they came, as it were, through a curtain, between one oar stroke and the next running out of the storm, and the next running out of the storm into a clear air where the light of after sunset glowed in the sky and on the sea. Over the foam-crested waves, they saw not far off a high, round, green hill, and beneath it, a town built on a small bay where boats lay at anchor, all in peace. The steersman, leaning in on his long sweep, turned his head and called, "Sir, is this true land or a witchery?" "Keep her as she goes, you witless wooden head. Row, you spineless slave sons. That's Thwill Bay and the Knoll of Roke, as any fool could see. Row!" So to the beat of the drum, they rowed wearily into the bay. There it was still, so that they could hear the voices of people up in the town and a bell ringing, and only far off the hiss and roaring of the storm. Clouds hung dark to the north and east and south, a mile off, all about the island. But over Roke, stars were coming out one by one in a clear, quiet sky. Chapter 3, The School for Wizards. Pardon me. Tea is required. Chapter 3, The School for Wizards. Ged slept that night aboard the Shadow, and early in the morning parted with those first sea comrades of his, they shouting good wishes cheerfully after him as he went up the docks. The town of Thwill was not large, its high houses huddling close over a few steep, narrow streets. To Ged, however, it seemed a city, and not knowing where to go, he asked the first townsman of Thwill he met where he could find the warder of the School on Roke. The man looked at him sidelong a while and said, "The wise don't need to ask, the fool asks in vain," and so went on along the street. Ged went uphill till he came out into a square, rimmed on three sides by the houses with their sharp slate roofs, and on the fourth side by the wall of a great building whose few small windows were higher than the chimney tops of the houses. A fort or castle it seemed, built of mighty gray blocks of stone. In the square beneath it, market booths were set up, and there was some coming and going of people. Ged asked his question of an old woman with a basket of mussels, and she replied, "You cannot always find the warder where he is, but sometimes you find him where he is not," and went on crying her mussels to sell. In the great building, near one corner, there was a mean little door of wood. Ged went to this and knocked loud. To the old man who opened the door, he said, "I bear a letter from the mage Ogion of Gaunt to the warder of the school on this island. I want to find the warder, but I will not hear more riddles and scoffing." "This is the school," said the old man said mildly. "I am the doorkeeper. Enter if you can." Ged stepped forward. It seemed to him that he had passed through the doorway, yet he stood outside on the pavement where he had stood before. Once more he stepped forward, and once more he remained standing outside the door. The doorkeeper, inside, watched him with mild eyes. Ged was not so much baffled as angry, for this seemed like a further mockery to him. With voice and hand, he made the opening spell which his aunt had taught him long ago. It was the prize among all her stock of spells, and he wove it well now. But it was only a witch's charm, and all the power that held the doorway was not moved at all. When that failed, Ged stood a long while there on the pavement. At last, he looked at the old man who waited inside. I cannot enter, he said unwillingly, unless you help me. The doorkeeper answered, say your name. Then again, Ged stood a while, for a man never speaks his own name aloud until more than his life's safety is at stake. I am Ged, he said aloud. Stepping forward, then, he entered the open doorway. Yet it seemed to him that though the light was behind him, a shadow followed him in at his heels. He saw also, as he turned, that the doorway through which he had come was not plain wood, as he had thought, but ivory without joint or seam. It was cut, as he knew later, from a tooth of the great dragon. The door that the old man closed behind him was of polished horn, through which the daylight shone dimly, and on its inner face was carved the thousand-leaved tree. Welcome to this house, lad, the doorkeeper said, and without saying more, led him through halls and corridors to an open court far inside the walls of the building. The court was partly paved with stone, but was roofless, and on a grass plot a fountain played under young trees in the sunlight. There Ged waited alone some while. He stood still, and his heart beat hard, for it seemed to him that he felt presences and powers at work unseen about him here, and he knew that this place was built not only of stone, but of magic stronger than stone. He stood in the innermost room of the house of the wise, and it was open to the sky. Then suddenly he was aware of a man clothed in white, who watched him through the falling water of the fountain. As their eyes met, a bird sang aloud in the branches of the tree. In that moment, Ged understood the singing of the bird, and the language of the water falling in the basin of the fountain, and the shape of the clouds, and the beginning and end of the wind that stirred the leaves. It seemed to him that he himself was a word spoken by the sunlight. Then that moment passed, and he and the world were as before, or almost as before. He went forward to kneel before the archmage, holding out to him the letter written by Ogion. The archmage Nemerly, warder of Roke, was an old man, older, it was said, than any man then living. His voice quavered like a bird's voice when he spoke, welcoming Ged kindly. His hair and beard and robe were white, and he seemed as if all darkness and heaviness had been leached out of him by the slow usage of the years, leaving him white and worn as driftwood that has been a century adrift. My eyes are old, and I cannot read what your master writes, he said in his quavering voice. Read me the letter, lad. So Ged made out and read aloud the writing, which was in Hardic runes, and said no more than this. Lord Nemerly, I send you one who will be greatest of the wizards of Gaunt, if the wind blows true. This was signed, not with Ogion's true name, which Ged had never yet learned, but with Ogion's rune, the closed mouth. He who holds the earthquake on a leash has sent you, for which be doubly welcome. Young Ogion was dear to me when he came here from Gaunt. Now tell me of the seas and portents of your voyage, lad. A fair passage, Lord, but for the storm yesterday. What ship brought you here? Shadow, trading from Andrades. Whose will sent you here? My own. The archmage looked at Ged and looked away and began to speak in a tongue that Ged did not understand. mumbling as will an old man whose wits go wandering among the years and islands. Yet in among his mumbling there were words of what the bird had sung and what the water had said falling. He was not laying a spell, and yet there was a power in his voice that moved Ged's mind so that the boy was bewildered, and for an instant seemed to behold himself standing in a strange, vast desert place among shadows. Yet all along he was in the sunlit court, hearing the fountain fall. A great black bird, a raven of Oskill, came walking over the stone terrace and the grass. It came to the hem of the archmage's robe and stood there all black with its dagger beak and eyes like pebbles, staring sidelong at Ged. It pecked 3 times on the white staff Nemmerly leaned on. Where am I? It pecked 3 times on the white staff Nemmerly leaned on, and the old wizard ceased his muttering and smiled. "Run and play, lad," he said at last, as to a little child. Ged knelt again on one knee to him. When he rose, the archmage was gone. Only the raven stood eyeing him, its beak outstretched as if to peck the vanished staff. It spoke in what Ged guessed might be the speech of Oskill. "Taranon Uspek," it said, croaking. "Taranon Uspek Orik," and it strutted off as it had come. Ged turned to leave the courtyard, wondering where he should go. Under the archway, he was met by a tall youth who greeted him very courteously, bowing his head. "I am called Jasper, Enwit's son of the domain of Ogle on Havnor Isle. I am at your service today to show you about the great house and answer your questions if I can. How shall I call you, sir?" Now, it seemed to Ged, a mountain villager who had never been among the sons of rich merchants and noblemen, that this fellow was scoffing at him with his service and his sir and his bowing and scraping. He answered shortly, "Sparrowhawk, they call me." The other waited a moment, as if expecting some more mannerly response, and getting none, straightened up and turned a little aside. He was 2 or 3 years older than Ged, very tall, and he moved and carried himself with a stiff grace, posing, Ged thought, like a dancer. He wore a gray cloak with hood thrown back. The first place he took Ged was the wardrobe room, where, as a student of the school, Ged might find himself another such cloak that fitted him, and any other clothing he might need. He put on the dark gray cloak he had chosen, and Jasper said, "Now you are one of us." Jasper had a way of smiling faintly as he spoke, which made Ged look for a jeer hidden in his polite words. "Do clothes make the mage?" he answered sullenly. "No," said the older boy, "though I have heard that manners make the man. Where now?" "Where you will. I do not know the house." Jasper took him down the corridors of the great house, showing him the open courts and the halls, the room of shelves where the books of lore and rune tomes were kept, the great hearth hall where all the school gathered on festival days, and upstairs in the towers and under the roofs, the small cells where students and masters slept. Ged's was in the south tower, with a window looking down over the steep roofs of Thwilltown to the sea. Like the other sleeping cells, it had no furnishings but a straw-filled mattress in the corner. "We live very plain here," said Jasper, "but I expect you won't mind that." "I'm used to it." Presently, trying to show himself the equal of this polite, disdainful youth, he added, "I suppose you weren't when you first came?" Jasper looked at him, and his look said without words, What could you possibly know about what I, son of the Lord of the domain of Ogle, on the island of Havnor, am or am not used to? What Jasper said aloud was simply, "Come on, this way." A gong had been rung while they were upstairs, and they came down to eat the noon meal at the long table of the refectory, where, with 100 or more boys and young men, each waited on himself, joking with the cooks through the window hatches of the kitchen that opened into the refectory, loading his plate with great bowls of food that steamed on the stills, sitting where he pleased at the long table. "They say," Jasper said to Ged, "that no matter how many sit at this table, there is always room." Certainly there was room both for many noisy groups of boys talking and for older fellows, their gray cloaks clasped with silver at the neck, who sat more quietly by pairs or alone, with grave, pondering faces, as if they had much to think about. Jasper took Ged to sit with a heavy-set fellow called Vetch, who said nothing much, but shoveled in his food with a will. He had the accent of the East Reach, and was very dark of skin, not red-brown like Ged and Jasper and most folks of the archipelago, but black-brown. He was plain, and his manners were not polished. He grumbled about the dinner when he had finished it, but then, turning to Ged, said, "At least it's not illusion, like so much around here. It sticks to your ribs." Ged did not know what he meant, but he felt a certain liking for him, and was glad when after the meal he stayed with them. They went down into the town that Ged might learn his way about it. Few and short were the streets of Thwill. They turned and twisted curiously among the high-roofed houses, and the way was easy to lose. It was a strange town, and strange also its people, fishermen and workmen and artisans like any others, but so used to the sorcery that is ever at play on the Isle of the Wise that they seemed half sorcerers themselves. They talked, as Ged had learned, in riddles, and not one of them would blink to see a boy turn into a fish or a house fly up into the air, but knowing it for a schoolboy prank, would go on cobbling shoes or cutting up mutton unconcerned. Coming up past the back door and around through the gardens of the great house, the three boys crossed the clear running Thwillburn on a wooden bridge and went on northward among woods and pastures. The path climbed and wound. They passed oak groves where shadows lay thick of all the brightness of the sun. Where shadows lay thick for all the brightness of the sun. There was one grove not far away to the left that Ged could never quite see plainly. The path never reached it, though it always seemed to be about to. He could not even make out what kind of trees they were. Vetch, seeing him gazing, said softly, "That is the imminent grove. We can't come there yet." In the hot, sunlit pastures, yellow flowers bloomed. "Sparkweed," said Jasper. "They grow where the wind dropped the ashes of burning Ilion, when Erith Akbe defended the inward isles from the Fire Lord." He blew on a withered flower head, and the seeds shaken loose went up on the wind like sparks of fire in the sun. The path led them up and around the base of a great green hill, round and treeless, the hill that Ged had seen from the ship as they entered the charmed waters of Roke Island. On the hillside, Jasper halted. "At home in Havnor, I heard much about Gauntish wizardry, and always in praise, so that I've wanted for a long time to see the manner of it. Here now we have a Gauntish man, and we stand on the slopes of Roke Knoll, whose roots go down to the center of the earth. All spells are strong here. Play us a trick, Sparrowhawk. Show us your style." Ged, confused and taken aback, said nothing. Later on, Jasper, Vetch said in his plain way. Let him be a while. He has either skill or power, or the doorkeeper wouldn't have let him in. Why shouldn't he show it, now as well as later? Right, Sparrowhawk? I have both skill and power, Ged said. Show me what kind of thing you're talking about. Illusions, of course. Tricks. Games of seeming. Like this. Pointing his finger, Jasper spoke a few strange words, and where he pointed, on the hillside among the green grasses, a little thread of water trickled and grew, and now a spring gushed out, and the water went running down the hill. Ged put his hand in the stream, and it felt wet, drank of it, and it was cool, yet for all that it would quench no thirst, being but illusion. Jasper with another word stopped the water, and the grasses waved dry in the sunlight. Now you, Vetch, he said with a cool smile. Vetch scratched his head and looked glum, but he took up a bit of earth in his hand and began to sing tunelessly over it, molding it with his dark fingers, and shaping it, pressing it, stroking it, and suddenly it was a small creature, like a bumblebee or furry fly, that flew humming off over Roke Knoll and vanished. Ged stood staring, crestfallen. What did he know but mere village witchery, spells to call goats, cure warts, move loads, or mend pots? I do no such tricks as these, he said. That was enough for Vetch, who was for going on, but Jasper said, Why don't you? Sorcery is not a game. We Gauntish men do not play it for pleasure or praise, Ged answered haughtily. What do you play it for? Jasper inquired. Money? No! But he could not think of anything more to say that would hide his ignorance and save his pride. Jasper laughed, not ill-humoredly, and went on, leading them on around Roke Knoll. And Ged followed, sullen and sore-hearted, knowing he had behaved like a fool and blaming Jasper for it. That night, as he lay wrapped in his cloak on the mattress, in his cold, unlit cell of stone, in the utter silence of the great house of Roke, the strangeness of the place and the thought of all the spells and sorceries that had been worked there began to come over him heavily. Darkness surrounded him. Dread filled him. He wished he were anywhere else but Roke. But Vetch came to the door, a little bluish ball of wear-light nodding over his head to light the way, and asked if he could come in and talk a while. He asked Ged about Gaunt, and then spoke fondly of his own home isles of the East Reach, telling how the smoke of village hearth fires is blown across that quiet sea at evening between the many small islands with funny names, Corp, Cop, and Hulp, Venway and Vemish, Iffish, Coppish, and Sneg. When he sketched the shapes of those lands on the stone of the floor with his finger to show Ged how they lay, the lines he drew shone dim, as if drawn with a stick of silver for a while before they faded. Vetch had been 3 years at the school, and soon would be made a sorcerer. He thought no more of performing the lesser arts of magic than a bird thinks of flying. Yet a greater, unlearned skill he possessed, which was the art of kindness. That night, and always from then on, he offered and gave Ged friendship, a sure and open friendship, which Ged could not help but return. Yet Vetch was also friendly to Jasper, who had made Ged into a fool that first day on Roke Knoll. Ged would not forget this, nor, it seemed, would Jasper, who always spoke to him with a polite voice and a mocking smile. Ged's pride would not be slighted or condescended to. He swore to prove to Jasper and to all the rest of them among whom Jasper was something of a leader, how great his power really was someday. For none of them, for all their clever tricks, had saved a village by wizardry. Of none of them had Ogion written that he would be the greatest wizard of Gaunt. So, bolstering up his pride, he set all his strong will on the work they gave him, the lessons and crafts and histories and skills taught by the gray-cloaked masters of Roke, who were called the Nine. Part of each day he studied with the master chanter, learning the deeds of heroes and the lays of wisdom, beginning with the oldest of all songs, the creation of A. There, with a dozen other lads, he would practice with the master wind key at arts of wind and weather. Whole bright days of spring and early summer, they went out in Roke Bay in light catboats, practicing steering by word and stilling waves and speaking to the world's wind and raising up the mage wind. These were very intricate skills, and frequently Ged's head got whacked by the swinging boom as the boat jibed under a wind suddenly blowing backwards, or his boat and another collided, though they had the whole bay to navigate in, or all three boys in his boat went swimming unexpectedly as the boat was swamped by a huge unintended wave. There were quieter expeditions ashore other days with the master herbal, who taught the ways and properties of things that grow, and the master hand taught sleight and jugglery and the lesser arts of changing. At all these studies, Ged was apt, and within a month, he was bettering lads who had been a year at Roke before him. Especially the tricks of illusion came to him so easily that it seemed he had been born knowing them and needed only to be reminded. The master hand was a gentle and light-hearted old man who had endless delight in the wit and beauty of the crafts he taught. Ged soon felt no awe of him, but asked him for this spell and that spell, and always the master smiled and showed him what he wanted. But one day, having it in mind to put Jasper to shame at last, Ged said to the master hand in the court of seeming, "Sir, all these charms are much the same. Knowing one, you know them all. And as soon as the spell weaving ceases, the illusion vanishes. Now, if I make a pebble into a diamond," and he did so with a word and a flick of his wrist, "what must I do to make that diamond remain diamond? How is the changing spell locked and made to last?" The master hand looked at the jewel that glittered on Ged's palm, bright as the prize of a dragon's hoard. The old master murmured one word, "Tolk." And there lay the pebble, no jewel, but a rough gray bit of rock. The master took it and held it out on his own hand. "This is a rock, Tolk in the true speech," he said, looking mildly up at Ged now. "A bit of the stone of which Roke Isle is made, a little bit of dry land on which men live. It is itself. It is part of the world. By the illusion change, you can make it look like a diamond, or a flower, or a fly, or an eye, or a flame." The rock flickered from shape to shape as he named them, and returned to rock. But this is more seeming, mere seeming. Illusion fools the beholder's senses. It makes him see and hear and feel that the thing has changed, but it does not change the thing. To change this rock into a jewel, you must change its true name. And to do that, my son, even to a small scrap of the world, is to change the world. It can be done. Indeed, it can be done. It is the art of the master changer, and you will learn it when you are ready to learn it. But you must not change one thing, one pebble, one grain of sand, until you know what good and evil will follow on that act. The world is in balance, in equilibrium. A wizard's power of changing and of summoning can shake the balance of the world. It is dangerous, that power. It is most perilous. It must follow knowledge and serve need. To light a candle is to cast a shadow. He looked down at the pebble again. A rock is a good thing too, you know, he said, speaking less gravely. If the isles of Earthsea were all made of diamond, we'd lead a hard life here. Enjoy illusions, lad, and let the rocks be rocks. He smiled, but Guinn left dissatisfied. Press a mage for his secrets, and he would talk, like Guinn, about balance and danger and the dark. But surely a wizard, one who has gone past these childish tricks of illusion to the true arts of summoning and change, was powerful enough to do what he pleased and balance the world as seemed best to him and drive black darkness with his own light. In the corridor, he met Jasper, who, since Ged's accomplishments began to be praised about the school, spoke to him in a way that seemed more friendly, but was more scoffing. You look gloomy, Sparrowhawk, he said now. Did your juggling charms go wrong? Seeking, as always, to put himself on equal footing with Jasper, Ged answered the question, ignoring its ironic tone. I'm sick of juggling, he said. Sick of these illusion tricks, fit only to amuse idle lords in their castles and domains. The only true magic they've taught me yet on Roke is making wear-light and some weather working. The rest is mere foolery. Even foolery is dangerous, said Jasper, in the hands of a fool. At that, Ged turned as if he had been slapped and took a step towards Jasper, but the older boy smiled as if he had not intended any insult, nodded his head in a stiff, graceful way, and went on. Standing there with rage in his heart, looking after Jasper, Ged swore to himself to outdo his rival, and not in some mere illusion match, but in a test of power. He would prove himself and humiliate Jasper. He would not let the fellow stand there looking down at him, graceful, disdainful, hateful. Ged did not stop to think why Jasper might hate him. He only knew why he hated Jasper. The other apprentices had soon learned they could seldom match themselves against Ged, either in sport or in earnest, and they said of him, some in praise and some in spite, he is a wizard born, he'll never let you beat him. Jasper alone neither praised him nor avoided him, but simply looked down at him, smiling slightly. And therefore Jasper stood alone as his rival, who must be put to shame. He did not see, or would not see, that in this rivalry, which he clung to and fostered as part of his own pride, there was anything of the danger, the darkness, of which the master hand had mildly warned him. When he was not moved by pure rage, he knew very well that he was yet no match for Jasper or any of the older boys, and so he kept at his work and went on as usual. At the end of the summer, the work was slackened somewhat, so there was more time for sport. Spellboat races down in the harbor, feats of illusion in the courts of the great house, and in the long evenings, in the groves, wild games of hide and seek, where hiders and seekers were both invisible, and only voices moved laughing and calling among the trees, following and dodging the quick, faint wear-lights. Then, as autumn came, they set to their tasks afresh, practicing new magic. So, Ged's first months at Roke went by fast, full of passions and wonder. And Next paragraph, we begin winter, and it's 10, so maybe that's a transition spot.